Thank you very much for coming in this afternoon. I want to begin by thanking Peter and Emmanuel for inviting me to this event. The first part of my title, How Much Is Your African Slave Worth?, was generated by two particular occasions. The first is my reading of an actual slave market and the ways in which the auction block worked and how the black body was being sold. Reading the reports of one such market goes something like this. The bid caller says, here is a young blood and a capital one. How much would you bid for him? 1,000, a bid caller shouted. Another one, the actual caller says, the original bid caller says, $1,000 is not worth it. This is $1,000 for a boy who will be worth in 3 years. Fully $2,500 cash down. End of his statement. So the bidding continues, and the black enslaved young man is finally sold for $3,000. The second occasion that led me to this title is reading a set of wills. And there's a will of a woman called Miss Mary Chapman, who, when she writes her will, writes the following. To my beloved son Matthew, I give and bequeath my Negro man Albert and my Negro girl Anne, and all my cattle, mules, and hogs. End of that section of the will. In these two instances, both the auction and the will, the enslaved black body is not just a body for labor. It is a commodity which is monetized, brought and sold on the market, the auction block, and bequeathed as having value to children. However, the enslaved black body was not just a monetized commodity of value to be brought and sold, and it was also sometimes used as mortgage. Thomas Jefferson often used his enslaved people as mortgages, as either leasing them out or as collateral for a set of mortgages that he felt he had to engage in. What is interesting is in conventional political thought in the 1600s, say, understanding of John Locke, slavery is understood as a result of debt peonage or of prisoners of war. But it was not understood as slavery as something and a phenomenon of perpetuity. But here in the Atlantic world, the African slave was a property in person, but he or she was property in person in perpetuity, living under a social system of near total domination, of having social and civil debt, and as a human being producing commodities, sugar, coffee, cotton, indigo, in the Atlantic world. And this particular Atlantic world, producing commodities and by being property in person, was him or herself experiencing what I like to call a process of double commodification. This particular process of double commodification produces processes of exchange, credit, and debt. It was not just unfree labor, but in the words of Sylvia Winter, that this particular slave body was also one of lack. But the black slave, or the African slave, I would also want to argue, represented both labor and capital, but both categories defined by a price. Now, it seems to me that if we argue that racial slavery or colonialism were not incidental or epiphenomenal, but were really embedded within and shaped the making of the modern world, particularly capitalism, not as a specific phase a la Marx of, say, primitive accumulation, but really was one of the critical elements in the growth and consolidation of capitalism. That is, the Atlantic slave trade, slave-based economic activities to value-added things in the commodity supplies of these particular activities. Then what we are seeing is the emergence of the modern in the figure of the African slave, who is a figure that is double commodified. As such, therefore, once we mark this, then there is a different archive which opens to us, one in which we now have to think about, in my view, some of the most profound social questions, both historically and in the present. I think that in that way, to think about this enslaved body, therefore, to think about it as a body that can function both as credit or debt, means that the modern governmentality, which develops certain technologies of rule about this particular body, was not just one of discipline or control, but also one of saturation. For the colonial and racial governmentality, the central repertoire of rule, of technology of rule, was therefore not just discipline and control, or where might was right, but was also the creation of certain subjectivities. And it was the creation of the figure of the Negro and the creation of the native. Let us pay a little bit of attention, for example, to the laws of Virginia of the 1600s. And look, for example, at the transition between indentured servitude, which began in colonial Virginia, and in the late 1500s and early 1600s, and when the period when the Dutch brought the first slaves to Jamestown in 1619, and how after 1619 those laws began to change. So that by 1662, for example, inside Virginia, one of the laws Virginia laws made clear was that Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of the mother. That is, that if the mother was a slave, then the child was a slave, no matter who his or her father was. And this is important because this actually ran against British common law, where it was the father who was the actual, who would be identified as can identify with the child, and this is what the child was, given the status of the father. And this is also this becomes important because what you then begin to think through is the questions of gender in slavery and the way in which black women bodies were then transformed into certain wombs that were really wombs for slave children. And then how that later on, in fact, transformed black women into just breeding cattle. And the ways in which you would then see at the slave market, women who were especially advertised and monetarized as to what was their capacity to actually have children. The other law that I think is fascinating is a 1667 law in Virginia, which declares that the baptisms of slaves does not exempt them from bondage. And this is actually very, very important, I think, because one of the interesting things about slavery and colonialism and the construction of the Negro and the construction of the native is about who is human and who is not human. And if you have a situation where your humanity in the 1600s is not yet quite, the Enlightenment is not yet quite, quite taken off, where the actual humanity of the person is constructed around if he or she is a Christian. And then what you then argue, you then set up a law which then says that if the person is baptized, which is a sign of being a Christian, that does not stop them from being bondage. That does not stop them from being slaves. So it would just seem to me that to think through some of these laws, and to think about, and there are other laws which are important, particularly the Georgia law, which argues in the 1700s about how, in fact, the slaves can be used as collateral, and under what conditions can if I have used the slaves as collateral, can I keep the slaves if you do not pay me back? Right? Under what are the conditions for those, and what are the courts, in fact? What courts have been set up for those things to be dealt with? It would seem to me that to think through the question of debt, and to think through the question of debt in relationship to when debt is not just money, but is actually a human body itself that is enslaved, what kind of new ways, what kind of archives does that open us for us to begin to think about and think through questions of domination. Thinking a little bit further about capitalism in itself and the relation of capitalism to this business of slavery, Winter, in a yet unpublished manuscript that some of us are working on, cites Marx a great deal. And when she says there's a section in the manuscript in which she says Marx makes the point that about the primitive accumulation, which she accepts in her work. But she also goes on to say that Marx makes the point that that those who traded slaves were capitalists themselves. And that seems to me to, when one reads actually, not just Winter, but reads back Marx in that particular quote, what you see is a particular tension between an understanding of primitive accumulation as a kind of specific moment in the development of capitalism, yet an understanding that those persons who were doing slave trading or who were involved in what I like to call slave-based economic activities and the value added to those value-added things to those activities of economic change were themselves capitalists. And the key people in this, in my view, are the Dutch merchant bankers. They were not just merchant, but they were merchant bankers. I've spent a lot of time in the last 6 months in Amsterdam working through the archives, and it's clear to me that what you're looking through are figures of merchant bankers who were entrepreneurs, who practiced and who set up companies like the Dutch East India Company or the Dutch West Indian Company, which were essentially joint stock companies in the early 1600s, and how those joint stock companies in fact function through debt and credit. And ways in which I would say that in the 1700s, in 1760s, when the Amsterdam Stock Exchange is beginning to be in some kind of turmoil, and they think that there's going to be the first crash, the actual reason for the crash, for the turmoil, is that in the colony of Suriname, there's a sort of maroon wars, that is of enslaved people who are maroons, and the actual creditors who have given the planters money to run the plantations fear that they will not be paid back. And this leads to a certain turmoils on the Dutch Amsterdam Stock Exchange, and also then later on allows the London Stock Exchange to begin to take off in a certain way. So a point I want to make about this is as follows, that when one thinks about this question of the slave body as debt and credit, besides all the other things that people write about, lack and so on, and about questions of unfree labor, that what one really has to think about is this business of the plantation itself as a certain site. And I would want to argue that the plantation were essentially commercial centers of production for a world market. And as such, the actual black African slave was essentially a form of labor calculated in terms of his or her exchange value, bought and sold, not just as a slave, but as a commodity. He or she, therefore, was labor power in the economic system, which produced goods for the world market, and not on the basis of a kind of relatively constant needs, but on the basis of maximizing profit, which was seen as limitless. Now, when one takes this and understands this, I think, then how does one think about the stance of power itself? And here, following the Italian theorist Lorenzetto, right, who talks about debt as finance from the point of view of the debtors, and then who has the right to repay it, then the question I ask, when the debt is in the form of a human body, then how does that trouble all of that? So what are we to make of the enslaved African, for whom the question who uses either debt, credit, collateral for mortgage, who was always, using Shakespeare's phrase, a price for their pound of flesh, always seen as this price for the pound of flesh. How are we to think of power, therefore, working through this price of flesh, not just now pressing flesh in the brutal markings of the body of the slave, but using flesh as part of an exchange process in which debt is key. There's one other point I want to make here about the enslaved community and the questions of what their bodies may represent as commodities, even in death. And it is the cadaver trade which is big in this country. In this particular country, in the late 19th century, there was a wide-scale employment of people who were called resurrectionists. What was their job? Grave robbing. Who were they robbing the graves for of black slaves? They were robbing the black ex-slaves. They were robbing the graves to give to schools like Pennsylvania, UPenn Medical School, and Virginia Medical School. The experimentations of medical science in the 19th century, which developed medical science in this country, were done essentially on dead black bodies who were sold at something like $30 per body at medical school, to medical school. To me, it is one of the deepest ironies in this country to think of medical science working on bodies that were not supposed to be human. Finally, in this particular section, I think it is important to think about equity mortgages in the 1800s, again in this country, and to just use Virginia as one case. Virginia, between the years of 1818 to 1859, raised in human collateral, which is therefore enslaved people, in $215, something like $50 million. So that you are looking, therefore, at a particular way in which one has to think about questions of debt that is not just the way we like to think about it today, but trying to think about that and in relationship to an actual body, or to an enslaved body. And what does that mean? If you would permit me therefore now, I would want to make a huge temporal jump to the present. Because in my own mind, the way I think about history and use history in relationship to theory is that I think history travels. History travels as sedimented deposits which carry forward things, which carry forward structures, not as repetition, but as adaptation and rearrangement to actually create a particular, what Stuart Hall would call a conjunction. We live in a specific moment of late capitalism. Some of us call it neoliberalism. A lot of work has been done on neoliberalism as an ideological force. Particularly, again, the work of Stuart Hall, who thinks about, in an essay which he wrote just before he died, called the Neoliberal Revolution. The idea about neoliberalism is that it is constructed as a power, as a drive for totality. It's around questions of homo economicus. In the quest of the drive for totality, it is, in my view, there is the current of saturation. In that current of saturation, in my view, debt is central. To be in credit means to have credit means you have to be in debt. And what is interesting for me is thinking about these questions at this moment is to think about what ways does indebtedness today actually creates different subjectivity. What does a debt economy really mean? What happens when debt itself is actually an engine of the contemporary economy? What kind of subjectivities, what new forms of life are being created around that? Partly to answer that, I would argue that when debt becomes the engine of a contemporary economy, then that becomes a point of saturation. it begins to appear and work as a certain kind of technology of rule in which power seems to act freely because we who are indebted seem to choose that. But are we not choosing that because of the way in which we have been saturated, in the way in which a certain kind of governmentality no longer operates in the flesh, but operates through desire? What is my point here? My point here is that capitalism itself operates not only through forms of exploitation and domination, but it also operates through always creating forms of life, what I like to call modes of being human, as practices of life, practices of living, practices of material provisioning, and practices of exchange. If in racial slavery and colonialism, the black body could be deployed and exchanged as debt, as credit, was a commodity, it seems to me that in this particularly contemporary drive of capital, to make us all indebted humans, that what is required is a creation of a certain kind of subjectivity for capitalism's reproduction, or for the reproduction of capital. It is a logic, I would argue, that opened up with the colonial slave trade and racial slavery. Thanks.